this is our last class of the season. We're really excited to have Erica here. I'll let her introduce herself, but if you haven't been to one of our classes before, the first hour will kind of be slated more for the presentation, and then the last half hour is good for Q&A, especially if anybody needs to take off. Feel free after that point, but I will let Erica go ahead.
Just turning my cell phone on silent. Hadn't done that yet. Okay. Hello, the IPM manager. IPM, not everybody knows what that stands for, so it's integrated pest management. So there's a concept in horticulture where chemicals should always be your last option when treating for pests or diseases. And so IPM is a protocol where you go through and you fix things like watering and fertilizing and, different kinds of pruning and excluding insects by mechanical means. So you basically exhaust all of your other options before you get to chemicals. But my job here at the nursery is sort of like plant health for the nursery stock. Also the planted landscape, the trees and shrubs that we have here at the nursery. But I do scouting, so I go through and I look for the pests and diseases, and then sometimes they come off trucks with those things, and so I have to take the appropriate measures to fix whatever the problem is and get those plants back in stock so that they're healthy and ready to sell to the public. So I've been doing this for about 10 years here at this nursery, and I love my job. Just a quick statistic, about 80 to 85% of all problems with plants can be fixed without chemicals. They are usually abiotic versus biotic. So abiotic means that it's some other reason that is causing this problem. It's actually very uncommon in the grand scheme of things to have it actually be a pest or a disease. Most of these other issues can be resolved in a different way. So I've been doing this for a long time. I'm pretty familiar with how horticulture works. So we are going to just kind of go through some general fall cleanup, some care, some different tasks that you might need to do this time of the season. We're going to talk about some of the things that I have here up in the displays. You should all have a copy of this, and I'm basically just going to go in order. We'll talk about all of these items. And if you have any, quick questions, I can answer them as we go. But like Emily mentioned, I think the majority of the questions will just sort of wait until the end. If you need a longer answer, we can talk about it at that point. Okay, so just starting with general fall cleanup. Leaf it alone. So basically, the fallen leaves are a resource for you. They can act as a mulch, and they can, first of all, they can provide additional organic matter to our soils. Here in Utah, with our arid climate, our soils here have very little percentage of organic matter, which is why we have a lot of clay and rocks here in Utah in our soils. And so the addition of organic matter, like the leaves, like other mulches and composts, is really, really important to the overall health of the soil and how well moisture drains through it, but also how well it retains moisture. There are places in our valley that have a lot of sand, and the water just drains straight through and out. And then there are a lot of places in our valley that have nothing but clay, and that water doesn't go anywhere. It stays right where it is. So the organic matter serves a couple of different functions, but primarily it's to amend. And so you can really make use of a lot of your fallen leaves different ways you can use it specifically as a compost or a mulch around specific items in your yard that might need an extra layer of protection, or you can clean up those leaves and go put them in some kind of compost bin that can be easily constructed with some chicken wire and 2x4s if you wanted some kind of box to put your leaves in. But if you have a lot of leaves, use them. The only exception is when we get to the next section, if you know you've had any diseases, then you might want to get rid of those leaves, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the fallen leaves themselves, because they're considered brown matter, they're kind of dried. They don't have a lot of water in them when they fall. They are a good compost, but something like fruit from a tree or from your vegetable plants can have a lot of water, and that decomposition, that mush, can attract a and other kinds of diseases. Some fungal pathogens can be attracted to that moisture. So if you are cleaning up after a fruit tree, you're going to want to dispose of the fruit either just in your garbage can or have them be in a separate waste if you don't actually have a compost bin. I wouldn't use fruit to compost around a tree, for example. That's kind of counterintuitive. And then at this time of year, a good idea to take care of your tools. You would want to clean thoroughly with like a wire brush. You want to oil, you want to sharpen, you want to do whatever you need to do to make sure that those tools go through the months of winter without accruing any rust or any kind of stiffness. You want to make sure that everything is clean so that when you start pulling them out again in the spring, that they're ready to go. So it's also just a task for, like a busy work kind of task that you can keep yourself occupied this time of year. I do a lot of that here at the nursery too. This time of year is for me to catch up on all the things I haven't had time to do at other points. Okay, so talking about the diseases and the pests. So an example of when you would know you had a problem is a lot of times fruit trees will have aphids, or they'll have powdery mildew on roses, or you'll have some other kind of fungal infection like black spot or shot hole fungus around plum trees or any of the other prunus family like choke cherries. In those cases where you, over the course of a summer, have identified a very specific problem, the recommendation is not to use those leaves as compost, so that you're physically removing the spores and the insects that might have gone dormant on that material. You're removing them from the area so that the likelihood of reinfestation, reinfection is just simply reduced. You're not going to get 100% of it, but you will get a majority of it if you clean up those debris. So this is also a good time of year when the leaves have fallen off the trees or are falling off, to spray a dormant spray, which is an oil-based product, mineral oil. This is one that is a little bit thicker. So the one that's called dormant spray, the way that they refine this one is it's a little more crude than a horticultural oil. And this one you would only ever want to use when the trees are bare. So that would be in the fall if you needed to do some kind of treatment over the winter or the early spring before basically the flowers are out. There is a very short window in the spring where the flowers are opening that you can still use this, but you wouldn't want to use a dormant spray in the hot part of the summer because you're going to burn. But horticultural oil, the way that they excuse me, the way that they refine this is a little bit more conducive to hotter temperatures. So you can end up using this product a little bit in hotter temperatures. I still probably wouldn't use it above about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but you can use this through the spring and the earlier parts of the fall without burn. Okay, so another one that you can use this time of year is copper. Copper is like nature's sort of Lysol. It's a natural antibacterial and antifungal, so you can fix a lot of these problems with a copper spray. One of the things that can happen with copper is if you were to spray it on a tree that has leaves, it can turn those leaves black or just discolor them. It's not a sure thing. It doesn't happen 100% of the time, but it can happen. So some of the recommendation for copper is just to wait until the tree is naturally shedding its leaves to do this. But spraying all of these things at this time of year would be a good idea because you can you have better contact on the branches where all of these little ridges are and where the leaves have been attached. And at those attachment points, these crevices, is where a lot of fungal spores will go dormant for the winter. It's where a lot of other insects will go dormant for the winter. Some things like actual spider mites, they will crawl all the way down the trunk and go dormant in the soil. And then in the spring, they will come back out and crawl back up. So when you spray an oil this time of year, you might not be treating for spider mites, but you can be treating for area mites, which do go dormant on the trees. Aphid mites are usually the most common on pear type trees. So if you have a flowering pear or a fruiting pear, an oil is a really good idea at this time of year for the aphid mites. Okay, so this goes back to the question we were talking about, can you plant in the fall? You can plant any time of year you want as long as water is managed appropriately. But the bigger answer to your question is this is the best time of year to plant. And the reason for that is the most stressful point for any plant, a tree or a shrub, is when it's hot in the summer. That is when the plants have the hardest time taking up the most moisture. And so when you plant this time of year, roots can be growing at every minute that soil is not frozen solid. And if you plant in September, you get root growth in September, October, November, into December. We usually don't freeze our ground solid until sometime in December. It's frozen for maybe a month or 2 months, but then you get root growth in late February and March and April and May and June before it starts getting really, really hot. So if you think about it, you've had 9 months, 6 to 9 months of root growth before the hot part of the summer. And also, this time of year is a lot better on reducing transplant shock. So anything that you plant right before the hot weather is more likely to go, why did you do this to me? But the plants that are in the ground this time of year have better access to moisture through the fall with our rain and then the snowstorms that will be coming, and it's just cooler. They're not losing water out of their leaves as fast, so they just relax a little bit faster if you put them in the ground right now. So you do definitely want to also consider digging up and moving or dividing any of the perennials that you might have plans for in your yard. There are a number of perennials that can't really be divided. So if you're not sure, check with us and say, hey, can I divide my lavender? Probably not. But yes, you can divide your grasses. Yeah, you can divide your geraniums, your perennial geraniums, not the annuals. So check with us to make sure that you're okay to take a spade or some kind of knife or a saw and actually cut them apart and put them in multiple places in your yard. Dividing is a great way to make use of the money that you spent on that original perennial. You can save yourself a lot of time and money doing that. The grasses easily are divided. I usually just take one of the pointed shovels, and once you get it out of the ground, you get the whole crown out. You just take the shovel and jam it straight down the middle of the grass crown, and you've got yourself 2 or 3 or 4 new grasses. But that has to, the timing, the reason why now is because of that root growth, because it's less stress on them. They are trying to go dormant. They're not pushing as much of their energy up and into the leaf growth and the flower growth. So they're really just kind of getting ready to rest. But that root growth can keep going. Okay, so should you fertilize in the fall? Fertilizing sometimes is not the best thing to do this time of year, because nitrogen specifically signals to the plant to push top growth. It tells the plant to elongate those stems, and it tells the plant to put on additional leaves. And that's not something that you want the plant to focus on this time of year. Nitrogen isn't really stored in the roots the way that other nutrients are. And so adding a fertilizer this time of year, if it has too high of a nitrogen content, it can create that tender new growth that is more likely to freeze in our early season overnight frosts and freezes. You can have that die back just because that tissue hasn't had a chance to harden off and get ready for the winter yet. So if you are going to fertilize in the fall, you ought to use something that has a low nitrogen content, something that's pretty mild. There are some listed on here, like root stimulators, fish emulsion, milorganite. Milorganite, we have it in bags, 50-pound bags like this. The mic is something that you would want to use either when transplanting or when planting the new trees. It's something that kind of has to go in the ground next to the roots during planting. You can't really just put that on the top of the soil and have it move its way through. But just to clarify, mic is not really a fertilizer. It's a beneficial, it's a set of beneficial spores, fungal spores, that can act like additional roots and help the trees and shrubs to take in more water. They form a symbiotic relationship. They actually join flesh, and the mycorrhizae will grow out into the soil and take in those additional nutrients and water. And what they get, what the fungi multiples, what they get in return are some of the sugars, the carbohydrates that the trees and shrubs have been making through the season and are now sending down to their roots for the winter. So it's kind of a give and take relationship on both sides. And it's super beneficial. It's naturally occurring. You go dig up any plant or tree anywhere in the world and you will find mycorrhizae, but the exact species are sort of native to different areas. So the ones that you'll find here are going to be different than the ones you'd find in the eastern US. But it is a good way to inoculate and sort of give them a head start. So getting back to the fertilizing, if you are going to fertilize and you are going to use some kind of nitrogen product, you'd want to use it in the earlier part of fall, usually late September into October. So you'd be okay to use it right now while the plants are still not quite dormant and can take up some of that nitrogen and use it. If you put it on the soil in the winter when the trees and shrubs are completely dormant, they're not likely to take it up. They're not likely to absorb any of it. And a lot of the cost of the fertilizer is quite literally washed away by the snow. That material, those ions, the minerals that are in the fertilizer can just be picked up because they're mobile. They'll be picked up by the water and washed out of the soil, and then you have more or less wasted your money. Now, a lot of the time release fertilizers, they're not time release in regards to a clock. They're timed release or slow release based on temperature and water exposure. So some of them will release faster when it's hotter and slower when it's cool. So if you were to put down a slow release fertilizer in like February, you're basically not going to get any of that nitrogen out of the slow release until about April, but some of it is going to get washed away by the water. And then some of it, when it's a water released slow release, it's just, it's kind of common sense, but how much water has been applied to it. A little bit of that fertilizer is going to come off with every molecule of water. And so if you put it in heavy watering situations, you're going to exhaust that nutrient supply faster than if it were in a drier position in the yard. So if you are going to fertilize now. Use something that's on the mild side for nitrogen. The other nutrients, phosphorus and potassium, are a little less important to look at the numbers this time of year. Phosphorus is primarily used for root growth and for blooming in the summer. And then the potassium is used for a lot of different functions within the plants. So those numbers you also wouldn't want to put on something that's a really high content, but it's less important to watch this time of year than the nitrogen, which is always going to be the first number on a bag. That's the nitrogen content, and it's a percentage. So if it says something like 20, 10, 5, it means that 20% of that product is nitrogen. Okay, so should you prune in the fall? It depends. Deciduous trees and shrubs, you're going to want to wait until they are completely dormant. You probably won't do any significant damage if you were to prune now, but it's not recommended that you prune until that sap, that the xylem and phloem, when they stop moving up and down the trees, that's when you would want to prune. That's the ideal time. And that will happen when the trees are completely dormant, but the least chance of damage to the tree is going to be in late winter, which is all the way in March. So it's like the end of February into March would be the ideal time for most deciduous trees and shrubs. There are some different kinds of things like a hydrangea that, even though it's woody, you may want to deadhead this at this time of year because of snow load. These are going to catch snow and they could break under the weight of the snow. There are some other kinds of issues with that, like roses, and going back to the fall cleanup with the fleshy kinds of material that you may not want to keep around for diseases. So like a rose, you definitely would want to deadhead. But in terms of significant reduction cuts or thinning cuts or shaping cuts, those kinds of things, you would probably be better off to wait until the spring. Is if you have something like a forsythia. What did you bring me? A lilac? A forsythia or a lilac are both considered, they're not the only ones, but they're considered spring bloomers. So if you were to take this lilac right now and you were to cut it, you will be cutting flowers. Those flowers have already been developing on a microscopic scale inside all of these leaf buds and these meristems right here at the very tips of these branches and at the bases of these leaves. And so If you cut them off, you're physically removing all of the flowers that would be blooming next spring. If it's a spring bloomer, the recommendation is to cut it right after it's done blooming. Forsythias the last couple years have been blooming in like April. I remember sometimes when forsythias bloomed as early as February, but you'd never quite know until the spring comes around. It is temperature dependent. They usually wait until the ground is at 50 degrees or so Fahrenheit before the forsythias start blooming. So that can be a signal that spring is here, that the ground has thawed out. So in the spring, if you see the forsythias in bloom, it's time to start doing things in the yard. Now, with that late season pruning, that's also when you would want to focus on your fruit trees and do whatever kinds of pruning on your fruit trees is necessary for keeping the trees at a height that's manageable, where you can harvest easily. If you need to do any sort of major cuts, the recommendation is no more than 30% of the tree's crown in any given round of cutting. You can take more than 30% in a season, but you need to give that tree a chance to recover from that initial hit before you start cutting at it again. So it's sort of hard to estimate exactly what 30% is. So what I do is I try and stand back from the tree and go, okay, if I take this branch and I take this branch, how much of this crown is that going to be? Oh, it's probably about 25%. So I might be able to take one other major branch at that point and call it good. If it's this branch and it's only 10%, keep going. Do what you need to do, as long as you're not massacring the tree in any go. All right. So the roses, one quick thing that I definitely do want to mention with the roses is when the canes are open, like when you have made a fresh cut, the meat, the flesh that's right in the middle of the cane is a little bit softer than the rest of it. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but rose canes can be hollow. And when that is exposed, it's a really good opportunity for a different kind of insect called a borer, generally referred to as borer, but a cane borer can get in there and start eating at that tissue and hollow out those stems and end up either just killing that cane, or it can severely damage the rose. So there's a recommendation to take just some really simple Elmer's glue and put a dab of it on the top of the cuts afterward. And that's more just to protect for insects. It can also protect for diseases, but a lot of the diseases that roses will get are foliar. They're not really inside the stems. So like the powdery mildew, downy mildew, black spot, rust, those kinds of things are almost always on the leaves, not on the canes. They can have cane problems, but that's less common. Okay, conifers and broadleaf evergreens. This is one of the reasons why you would want to wait, is because of that tender growth. Sometimes when you cut a tree or a shrub, it will signal to it that it's time to start growing again. And that's why you wouldn't want to prune this time of year on a lot of things. If you shear something and it has that fresh new growth and then we freeze, you can damage all of that new growth that hasn't gone dormant. We kind of mentioned that, which is why on most evergreens, if you are going to do any kind of cuts, you would want to wait until the spring. I usually wait until, like if it's a spruce or some other kind of tree form conifer, I wait until I see the new candles starting to grow and starting to push, and that's when I would make whatever cuts I need to make on them. For the shrubby types like arborvitae and junipers that do shear, you're going to make any really big shearing deep cuts, then I would do that in the spring versus the fall. But if you have just kind of one weird branch over here that needs to come off this time of year just for snow load or anything like that, then there's no problem doing that now, as long as you're not doing anything major. You'd want to wait until spring for major. Okay. So perennials and grasses. It used to be that people would do all of their fall cleanup. They would take down all of their grasses. They would cut all of their perennials basically to the ground, depending on what it was, and get rid of that material. But one thing that has happened in doing that is the wildlife populations have been reduced, and it's because they don't have the materials, they don't have the food sources, the nesting locations, the shelter, the grass to build nests. They don't have that access anymore when we remove all of it. Seed heads are great winter food. The persistent fruit on a lot of crab apples, like this one here, persistent fruit can be small, hang on to, and they offer food to the birds. It's a really good thing to leave all of your perennials up until the spring. One thing you can do with your grasses, which is listed on here, is tying them up in what's called a sheave. And you can do it with just about any material you want. If you just want to use twine, if you want to use some kind of a burlap, that whatever the material is, that would be up to you. But basically what you do is you almost tie it into a ponytail. You tie it like this. And one of the things that you would want to do with this is leave this up. It helps secure it for snow loads, so you're not going to have a crown that comes open in the winter. It also makes it really easy to clean up in the spring. You've got all of your blades and your stems for the inflorescence. You've got them all tied together, and then you take a hedge trimmer or some kind of scissors, and you just cut right below where your tie is, and this whole thing will come off in one bunch, and you throw it in the trash. It makes it really easy to clean up your grasses. Highly recommend that. Very much easier. Okay, so how am I on time? I haven't looked. Okay. So the beneficial insects, I definitely want you to leave your perennials for the beneficial insects. Just like with the malicious insects, they do find places to hide in your yard over the winter. You know, the native bees, they really need shelter. A lot of them will look for places under the crowns of plants, and if you've taken down that crown, if you think about the plants themselves as almost like tents, they can create a little pocket of dry and warmth. It's almost like a little igloo at the base of the shrubs. So even if we have feet of snow, which may or may not ever happen again, but if we have feet of snow, there's this little pocket of warmth at the bottom of all of your perennials, and a lot of those beneficial insects are going to be under the plants. And if you've taken off the whole top of it and all of that snow is getting straight to the ground around that perennial, then it's reducing their habitat. But that can also create a rot issue. The snow can melt and make the crown of the plant so wet that it starts to rot and deteriorate. Where if it's a little bit of a pocket, then you have more protection. It actually stays drier. Okay, then we're going to flip over to the other side. Should you mulch in the fall? Yeah, it's a fantastic time to lay mulch, especially if you're going to put a mulch down that has a nutrient content in it. If it has something an organic compost that has, you know, the Nutrimulch with turkey manure, or some other kind of organic compost that has a steer manure or something in it that has a little bit of that mild nitrogen content, not super hot with nitrogen. We talked about that. But with that mild nitrogen and the organic matter, that can break down and help amend your existing soil over the course of the coming months, and your soil will be healthier and happier come spring. The nitrogen content is used by the native biome also. It's not just from the trees and the shrubs that are in your yard. That nutrient is really important to help support soil health, but you don't want it to be too hot. Okay. So this is also really important for retaining moisture and the temperature insulation. If you have some kind of plant that's a little bit sensitive to the cold, maybe you wanted to be adventurous and put something, might be a zone or two too warm for Utah. That mulch is a good way to keep it a little bit warmer. Sometimes people will build little cages over a banana plant. I've seen people plant bananas out in their yard and then mulch, hopefully get it to come back in the spring. I have seen it before where people will mulch around roses that are not quite hardy enough for Utah, but then you've got to be really careful that it's a dry mulch so it doesn't rot out your canes. But it can, especially on your new plantings, it can help insulate those roots from really, really cold temperatures. Cold can desiccate the roots, and desiccation is one of the only things that can really damage the roots. So the little bit warmer soil can hang on to more water. It can make the soil, the water that's in the soil, more accessible to the plants. It can delay that freeze so that your roots can keep growing a little bit longer into the winter. And then this last point about piling the mulch directly onto the trunks. Have you ever been out in a park or something and you've seen what I call volcano mulching, where somebody will pile mulch up against the trunk of a tree and it looks like a little mound? That is really bad for the trunk health. The trunk tissue is different than the root tissue, and the trunk tissue can rot with all of that extra moisture against it. So even if you're just mulching at any other time of year, whether it's fall, whether it's summer, it doesn't really matter, but never should the mulch be up against the trunk like that. So if you lay mulch, you can have it be as thick as you want. You could have a foot of mulch over here, and you could have it go all the way around the tree, but you need to take your fingers or your hand or something and clean it away from the side of the trunk so that the trunk itself doesn't have any mulch up against it. It's a really good place for boring beetles to get down in there when the trunk tissue is soft, and they can lay their eggs, and their larvae will get into the tree. And that happens primarily in the summer when the adults are out flying around, but that it provides a hiding place for those kinds of insects. But that rot is usually the issue. Sometimes we see trees coming back to the nursery that have died out in their first or second season, and a lot of times, a number of times, it's because they were planted too deep. It mimics being deeper in the ground, and the trees just can't handle it. So always make sure the mulch is away from the trunk. Okay, so what trees should you wrap in the winter? There are some examples over here of columnar type shrubs that you would want to wrap to avoid snow load damage. You are not wrapping them to keep them warm. Unless you are in a really, really windy spot, you might want to have some kind of sheet burlap to go around a columnar shrub. That would be like if you were at the mouth of a canyon and you always have cold canyon winds coming down into your yard, that might be a reason why you would need to wrap for insulation. If you're some of these houses, the developments that are right here by Point Mountain, the wind never stops blowing over here. There might be a reason for it over there. But generally speaking, temperature is not why you're wrapping these. Wind protection is not why you're wrapping these. You are wrapping them to prevent that snow load and the breakage over the winter. A lot of times on these evergreens, once those branches come down, they never really go back up. You kind of have to prune them out until and wait for the shrub to sort of recover over that spot. So examples of shrubs that you would want to wrap would be like arborvitae. Definitely wrap your arborvitaes. Columnar yews. The shorter, wider yews don't necessarily need to be wrapped, but like a Hicks yew, I would wrap. Some of the junipers. And a lot of these things you're going to wrap mostly when they're younger, but I would still wrap even if they're mature. It can be difficult to get up very high, but there are ways to do it. If you need to wrap something that's 15 feet tall, it actually doesn't take that much effort. You just stand a ladder next to it and you're good. But you can kind of see with this burlap that's on the arborvitae that it's sort of a candy cane appearance. I might go just a tiny bit close on those wraps, but this one is just an example of what it would look like. I usually leave as much space. Let me pull this out for 1 second. Okay. So this is a 2-inch burlap. We also sell it in 4-inch, but I usually leave at least 2 inches between this band and this band, but something like 6 inches over here might be 6-8 inches on this side might be a little bit too far apart. This one I'm sure would be fine because it's on the young side, but if you're really worried about it, I would make sure to wrap a little bit closer. Does anybody have any questions about this kind of wrapping? No? Okay. The other kind of wrapping is the white tree trunk wrapping. Got caught. That's been demonstrated here on this crabapple. Now, again, with the tree wrapping, you're not doing it for temperature necessarily. This white tree wrap that goes around the trunk goes from the ground to about the bottom branch. If you had a tree that had a really long gap between branching structures, whorls is what they call them, whorl. If you had a really big gap, then you might want to start a second tree wrap right there, or just sort of go around however you can and just keep going. The reason why you do this is to prevent what's called winter injury or southwest sun scald. And when I talk about this, you're going to start seeing it everywhere around the valley. But basically what happens is in the winter when the sun is low and the snow or the ground is reflecting the light, it warms up the cells on the south, southwest, and west side of the trunks. And those cells come out, they thaw, they come out of freeze, thaw, they become liquid again, and then we freeze overnight, and those cells, the water that's inside of them crystallizes and creates these sharp corners, and it breaks the cell walls in all of the cells that are up that side of the trunk. And so what it does is it creates these big cracks, these big ugly pieces of damage on this side of the trunk. It happens really badly on new trees. It's very much less common on a tree that has mature, thick, corky bark. So when you're doing the white tree wrap on the trunk, it's basically until that tree has mature bark. It can be 5 years, it could be 10 years if it's a slow growing tree, but it's something that you want to do in the first few years of a tree's growth until it starts to mature to prevent that kind of damage. That damage can actually take months or even a couple of seasons to appear, because what'll happen is all of that freeze will happen. It'll occur during, and the growing season comes around in April, May, June, and when the trunk starts to thicken, it starts to add more tissue around it and get thicker, that's when you start to see the damage appear. It can happen in the winter, but not even start showing up until July. You might not see it until July. And it can get worse and worse from season to season. You can have some damage appear in one season that may not be fatal. It may not really be an issue for the tree. But if it happens repeatedly, 2 or 3 or 4 seasons in a row, you might as well dig the tree out and replace it, because you're never going to fix that damage. It's never going to go away. And that side of the tree, the crown above it, will never look normal because all of the tissue on that side no longer conducts water and nutrients up and down. It's broken. So the white tree wrap acts like sunblock. Have you ever seen surfers with the white nose zinc? That's all. It's a sunblock. It prevents that drastic temperature change in the winter. It makes it so the tree stays cold and doesn't thaw out. You're not insulating for warmth, you're insulating for cold, if that makes sense. Okay, so next section, do you need to water in the winter? These days, yes. It used to be that we got enough snow in the winter. But I don't really recall more than one winter in the last decade that, I think it not just this winter, but was it the winter before that we really did have a lot of snow. It was a very wet winter, and that was almost abnormal for us these days. I would plan on not having enough water. So the answer is yes. I would say, especially plantings, you do want to go out and water in the winter. It's not as frequent as it would be in the summer. What watering in the winter looks like on a deciduous tree that is dormant would be like a 5-gallon bucket of water for every inch of caliper. This crabapple, to give you an idea, is about 9/4 of an inch to an inch. So like at about 5 gallons of water once every maybe 3 weeks without precipitation. What you're doing is preventing that desiccation of the roots. You're just making sure that the roots don't dry out. It's not that the trees are taking in a lot of water, it's that you're making sure that they don't go dry over the winter. You're just keeping them wet. Not soaking, sopping, rotting wet, but just to make sure that they don't dry out. But evergreens are a different story. Evergreens absolutely need water over the winter. They don't ever go tree. For deciduous trees and shrubs, I would say it's usually only the first couple of seasons until it really gets a good root system set out. Or if we go through a really bad dry spell in the winter, then maybe you would want to go out and water a mature planting. But evergreens, even if it's mature, you're going to want to go out and water occasionally, especially when it's new. So the varieties, junipers, yews, pines, spruce, cedar, basically anything that's a needled evergreen, but also your broadleaf evergreens. So things like laurels, euonymus, boxwoods, anything like that that hangs onto its leaves over the winter would be considered in something that you would want to keep up on. So the I would say something like this arborvitae would sort of match up with the 5 gallons mark. So something like this would probably get 5 gallons of water, but slightly more frequently than a deciduous tree would. I would probably go out and make sure, if nothing else, go check every other week and see if it's still wet, but probably every other week through the winter. There's a rule of thumb, water on the holidays, which would be Christmas, uh, what do they call it now? Human Rights Day, President's Day, and then sort of around St. Patrick's Day would kind of be your once a month-ish for deciduous trees to go check. But your evergreens, I would say twice as often, every other week. Okay, so wilt proof. Wilt proof is what they call an anti-transpirant. So humans, when they breathe, we respire, respiration. That's the process where we take in a breath and we let out a breath. The plants, they transpire. The process is a little bit different, but wilt proof is an anti-transpirant, and what it does is it artificially clogs the breathing pores where the trees and shrubs will lose moisture through the winter. So it can help preserve moisture in and help prevent winter desiccation of the leaves. It's hard to think of an arborvitae as having leaves, but these scales that are all over their leaves, they have the stomata, the little breathing pores all over them. And if you spray wilt proof on something like an arborvitae, you're holding the moisture in over the winter. That desiccation, that burn that can happen on arborvitae. You can also use wilt proof on something like a yew. You can use them on your broadleaf evergreen. You can use wilt proof on laurels and boxwoods, etc. So it's a good product for helping prevent that winter burn. The trick is, even though the evergreens don't go truly dormant, we've talked about that, they do give off a lot of moisture into the fall. They know we're going into winter. The temperature signals to them that it's time to shut down for the winter. And so they let out a lot of the moisture that they've been hanging on to for the last couple of months. So they get down to a level where it's like homeostasis for the winter, where they have enough moisture to make it through the winter without losing all of it. And this, if you spray it too early in the season and you clog those pores too early, and that moisture is left inside the scales on an arborvitae, and then we freeze, you have that same sort of crystallization and cracking inside an arborvitae because you've trapped water, moisture, that well of water that's in there, you've trapped it in there and it can't get out, and then it freezes. So the recommendation when you use wilt proof is to wait until early to mid-December to use it, because by then all of the excess moisture would have been released and you're retaining the moisture that is in it for the rest of the season. Yeah, I think I covered everything on that. Okay, early to mid-December is when I would use wilt proof. Okay. The last section is going to be about lawn care. Turf is a bit different than regular trees and shrubs. Yeah, it's a plant, but its nutritional needs are going to be a bit different. So something like a winterizer fertilizer can really do a good job of prepping your lawn to get through the winter and come out healthy in the spring. I'm not sure if we still have a bag of winterizer, but that word will appear on a lot of different fertilizer bags this time of year here at IFA or something. So for the blades of the grass, if you have too long of a blade, remember when we were talking about the perennials and I said if you cut them down and you have a lot of material right there, that it changes the thatch that's at the bottom of grass. It's opposite from the perennials. So if you leave the grass and it's these long blades and they sit there, they start to decompose and rot, and it creates the hiding places for the fungal infections. And so when I say opposite, on turf, you pretty much want to cut it almost as short as you can cut it before the winter, so you don't have a lot of excess material right on top of the turf that is rotting out those. And it also prevents the hiding places for the insects that can get in there over the winter. So a typical recommended height is 1.5 inches, depending on how well you take care of your turf. That can kind of change. Like if you can manage to cut your turf a tiny bit lower, 3/4 of an inch or an inch, that's still acceptable for the winter. But for a typical homeowner, 1.5 is kind of where you'd want to set your mower. And then as we get into the winter and we do have some snowfall, ideally, you don't want to pile your snow on turf. You can use that excess snow to water your new plantings in the winter, as long as you haven't used any kind of ice melt that has a salt, base to it. So if you're just shoveling and you never put salt out on your driveway, take the shovel, and put piles of snow around your new plantings. And then as that melts, you're making use of that free water for you. It can help keep that soil a little bit wetter. But on turf, it can rot it out. And then we talked about the winterizer, but like right now, end of October, early November would be ideal for the winterizer timing on turf. If you have had problems with fungal infections, now is a good time to treat for fungus, because the height of the grass will be reduced. So you're reducing the population of the spores when you take all of those blades away. So the access, the spores are more accessible right now for fungal treatments, but nitrogen can be a problem if you have had fungal infections. So nitrogen will feed fungus, and if you have or something in the past, if you've had a fungus, what it is, and it's a fungus and not grubs or something like that, be careful about putting on nitrogen this time of year, because it might just feed the fungus through the winter. So make sure that one or the other, whether you should or should not, and we can help you figure that out. So come and visit us and talk about your turf if you have any questions about that. And then aeration is the last point on here about fall care. If you are going to aerate only once a year, fall is the right time to do it. It opens up the pores and helps keep everything a little bit drier through the winter to avoid that rot. And those little clods that come out, they sort of break down over the course of the winter. And so you don't really have the ugly pieces all over your turf in the spring when it's exposed and it's starting to grow again. And then if you do aerate twice, the other time that you would want to do it is in the spring, right as things are starting to wake up again.